Are you looking to win $1 million easily? All you need to do is recreate a photographic negative image of an apparently crucified man on a 14-foot by 3-foot piece of linen, and it needs to have holographic characteristics so that when rendered as a three-dimensional profile based on the intensity of the shading, it should produce a precisely contoured 3D image of a human form. Oh, and apart from the linen, which will be supplied, everything must be made using only materials and methods that were available in medieval times, specifically between 1260 and 1390 AD. Perhaps not $1 million easy, after all. That's the challenge facing David Rolfe, a British documentary producer and researcher on the Shroud of Turin. He first announced the challenge to the British Museum in his 2022 documentary, Who Can He Be? The British Museum supervised a carbon-14 dating of the Shroud of Turin in 1988, with a number of laboratories around the world. This test declared that the shroud was not the genuine burial cloth of Christ, as many believe, because the test showed that it was produced in the 13th or 14th century. However, since then, many researchers have noticed that the test was flawed. Rolfe notes that carbon dating was new at the time, with only 7 laboratories in the world capable of doing the job. Any lab that got approval to work on the shroud would benefit from the publicity. In Washington, in a presentation after the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast on February 8, Rolfe said that the labs had agreed to a protocol that would include taking samples from several different parts of the cloth for scientific accuracy. However, when it came time to take the samples, the guardian of the shroud, not wanting to damage its integrity, said that a single sample should be taken from a corner of the fabric that showed signs of wear. A small sample from this area was divided into 3 samples for the laboratories to use. The determination that the shroud had been created by a forger in medieval times meant that the shroud went from hero to zero, said Rolfe. David Rolfe, a British documentary film producer, speaks on February 8, 2024, at a press conference organized by the National Shroud of Turin exhibition at the Marriott Marquis in Washington, D.C., to announce a $1 million challenge prize for anyone who can recreate the Shroud of Turin using only 14th century tools and techniques. But Rolfe added that the sampling created several problems. Engravings from centuries past show people holding the shroud for display, clutching the corners. People want a closeness to holy relics, he said, and the tighter you grip it, the more benefit you get. This introduced medieval pollutants to the cloth. He said restorers were very good at fixing important cloths and tapestries, to the point of repairs being nearly invisible. If, as museum officials said in 1988, some resourceful artist in the 1200s faked it and flogged it off, then Rolfe and other shroud enthusiasts claim it should be reproducible, including the unique characteristics that show the image of a man on the cloth does not contain any paint, ink, dye, stain or pigments, and that there is no image underneath the bloodstains. After almost 2 years of no response from the British Museum, the challenge is being extended to the United States by the National Shroud of Turin exhibit, a group hoping to create a permanent museum space in a city of museums for a shroud replica and education. According to Myra Adams, executive director, the group currently has a mini exhibit featuring an actual size photographic replica of the shroud on display at the Catholic Information Center in Washington through the end of February. The group announced the expanded challenge February 8. Any person, organization or institution in the U.S. can apply to undertake the $1 million challenge to create the image of a crucified man that appears on the linen shroud. Up to 3 applicants will be accepted, each of which will receive 3 pieces of linen the same size as the shroud as the base for the recreation. Rolfe said that many media outlets, especially in Britain, ran stories about the initial challenge to the British Museum, but none have followed up to find out if the museum has taken up the task, and if not, why is it leaving $1 million on the table? A donor who helped Rolfe finance his 2022 documentary also agreed to put up the money for the prize. The same donor agreed to cover the U.S. prize if anyone succeeds. He thinks his money is safe, Rolfe said. Rolfe and other shroud experts say the unique characteristics of the shroud are more clearly revealed through modern science. In May 1898, Italian photographer Seconda Pia took the first photograph of the shroud. When he looked at the negative, he saw an appearance suggesting a positive image. In more recent decades, other methods, including 3D scanning for relative density, have been used to study the shroud. It keeps on revealing, Rolfe said. He added that the image is encoded with three-dimensional information. The blood stains on the cloth came first, the image at a separate time after that. Although the blood came from contact with the body, the image shows that the areas closest to the cloth are denser than others further away, which is seen mainly around the nose and eyes. The prevailing theory is that an instantaneous burst of energy, possibly radiation, at the moment of the resurrection created the image on the shroud. Analysis has shown that the image does not include any ink or other traditional media. The medium is energy. The image is not an additive process. It is burned, said Rolfe. But it is burned to a depth of just 2 microns, which corresponds to the thickness of the primary cell wall of flax fiber. According to the challenge criteria, on the surface of a 200 micrometer thick fabric. I think the shroud was created for the era in which we live. Only our era has the tools to decipher the shroud, said Rolfe. He said that when the British Museum announced the carbon-14 results in 1988 and declared it a forgery, its scientists gave no indication that it was complex. However, Rolfe and others like Russ Briault, president of the Shroud of Turin Education Project, analyzed potential artists from the 14th century. They found no art or artists from that time who worked with the kind of tools and techniques that could have created the shroud, and none of the existing works of art from that period were made in the same style as that seen on the shroud, said Briault. He added that forensic pathology shows wounds consistent with crucifixion, a practice that the Romans ended in the 400s, and a recent archaeological discovery in Rome of a body that was crucified also shows similar injuries, including the placement of nails in the feet. Rolfe said the trial process will be overseen by Paolo di Lazzaro, a physicist who has studied the shroud, but he said, in a way, we don't need a judge. The essential characteristics of the shroud, including the depth of penetration of the image and other criteria, are right or wrong. It can't just be something that looks like the shroud. The challenge website defines 7 criteria for a successful proposal. Contestants must be able to replicate the above 7 characteristics simultaneously in a single life-size front-posterior image, i.e. with the same size and shape as the front-posterior figures of the Shroud of Turin, using only materials and methods available to an alleged medieval forger. Rolfe said that each candidate will receive 3 pieces of linen for the final project, to allow for some trial and error. He added that if candidates want to work on a 1-foot square, for example, they should be able to get a proof of concept.